The trail was quiet in the way nature often is when nothing appears wrong. Sunlight filtered through the trees. The river moved at an unhurried pace, and there were no signs of panic, no broken branches, no disturbed earth. And yet, sitting beside the water, was a backpack, upright, intact, and placed with intention. It was the kind of detail that doesn't make sense until much later, when investigators realize that calm can be more unsettling than chaos. Somari Tate had come to this trail for solitude, not risk. She was prepared, experienced, and familiar with outdoor routines that demanded awareness and caution. But when she didn't return, the story of that hike stopped abruptly, leaving behind only what she carried, and what she didn't. No phone, no wallet, no clear explanation. Just a bag left behind as if its owner had stepped away for a moment and never came back. Search teams would later walk the same ground, scanning the riverbanks and the tree line, trying to understand how a person could vanish from a place that seemed to offer no hiding spots. Cadaver dogs would trace her scent along the trail, following it faithfully for nearly half a mile. And then, without warning, it ended, right where tire tracks from an unidentified off-road vehicle cut through the earth. Not scattered, not rushed, simply gone. There were no signs of a struggle, no evidence of an accident, no confirmation of a crime. What remained was a question that refused to settle. How does someone disappear without leaving behind a moment of violence or distress? In cases like this, absence becomes the loudest detail. Every unanswered question grows heavier with time, and every quiet detail begins to feel deliberate. This is not a story defined by what is known, but by what cannot be explained. A trail that led forward, and then nowhere at all. Before her name became associated with a missing persons case, Somari Tate was known for her consistency. She was someone who found clarity in routine and calm in being outdoors, especially in places where the noise of daily life faded into the background. Hiking wasn't a reckless pursuit for her. It was a deliberate one, planned, researched, and respected. Friends and family described her as cautious without being fearful, independent without being isolated. Somari had spent years developing confidence in outdoor spaces. She understood trail safety, carried appropriate gear, and didn't approach nature as something to be conquered, but something to move through thoughtfully. Solitude was part of the appeal. Time alone on a trail gave her space to think, to reset, to breathe in a way that felt increasingly rare elsewhere. That preference for quiet would later complicate the search for answers, because it meant fewer witnesses and fewer points of reference. In her personal life, there were no signs of upheaval, no sudden changes, no unresolved conflicts, no plans left unfinished. She stayed in regular contact with people close to her and had a habit of checking in, especially when hiking alone. That predictability became one of the first reasons concern escalated. When Somari didn't return as expected, those who knew her best understood immediately that this wasn't a choice. It was a deviation from everything she was known to be. Her connection to the outdoors also placed her within a broader community, other hikers, kayakers, and locals familiar with the river trail she chose that day. It was considered secluded, yes, but not unknown. People passed through regularly, which made the idea of vanishing without notice harder to accept. Somari wasn't someone who disappeared into places without telling anyone. She left plans behind. She left expectations behind. And in this case, she left questions behind. As this story continues, it's important to approach it with care and attention to detail. If you're drawn to thoughtful, Responsible examinations of unresolved cases like this one consider subscribing to Beyond the Evidence. Each investigation focuses not just on what happened, but on who was affected, and why the answers still matter. Understanding who Somari Tate was is essential, because it establishes what she was not. She was not impulsive. She was not unreachable. And she was not someone who simply walked away from her life. Those facts don't solve the mystery, but they narrow the space in which the truth can exist. Somari Tate's independence was never mistaken for distance. She maintained close, steady relationships with family and friends, built on reliability rather than constant presence. She was the kind of person who didn't need frequent reassurance to stay connected, but she also didn't disappear without explanation. That balance, self-sufficient yet accountable, shaped how people understood her actions and noticed when something was wrong. Those closest to Somari were familiar with her hiking habits. They knew the routes she favored, the precautions she took, and the way she communicated before and after spending time outdoors. A completed hike was usually followed by a simple check-in, sometimes brief, sometimes casual, but always consistent. When that pattern broke, concern wasn't delayed by uncertainty. It was immediate, because silence was not part of who she was. Within the outdoor community, Somari was seen as capable and aware. She wasn't known for taking unnecessary risks or pushing beyond her limits. Other hikers and regular trail users recognized her as someone who respected shared spaces and followed unspoken norms of safety and courtesy. That reputation would later weigh heavily on investigators because it reduced the likelihood of reckless behavior or preventable mistake. What stands out most in examining Somari's relationships is the absence of conflict. There were no strained dynamics, no recent arguments, no indications that she felt pressured to withdraw or start over somewhere else. Her life showed continuity, plans extending forward, routines anchored in familiarity. Disappearance, in this context, wasn't just unexpected. It was contradictory. These character dynamics matter because they eliminate comfortable explanations. There was no personal fracture that could account for her absence, no relational rupture that suggested intent to leave. Every connection in Somari's life pointed outward, not away. And as the timeline moves closer to the day she vanished, those relationships become less about who she knew and more about who was left searching. The day Somari Tate set out on the trail began without urgency or deviation from her normal habits. She chose a familiar river route known for its quiet stretches and minimal elevation changes, a place that offered solitude without demanding risk. Weather conditions were stable, visibility was clear, and there was nothing to suggest that this hike would be anything other than routine. Somari prepared the way she always did. She packed intentionally, carrying only what she needed and nothing that would slow her down. Her plan did not include venturing off-trail or pushing into unfamiliar terrain. This was not an expedition or a challenge hike. It was time set aside for reflection and movement, the kind of outing she had completed many times before without incident. At some point along the river, Somari stopped. Whether it was to rest, observe the water, or simply take in the surroundings remains unknown. What is known is that her backpack was later found placed beside the riverbank, upright and undisturbed. It was not abandoned in haste. There were no signs it had been dropped or dragged. Its condition suggested intention, not interruption. That detail would come to define the case. If Somari had slipped, the backpack would likely have gone with her. If she had been startled or forced, evidence of disruption would have remained. Instead, the scene offered stillness, too much stillness. Investigators would later return to this moment repeatedly, trying to understand what circumstance could lead someone to set their belongings down and then vanish without a trace. In missing persons cases, the inciting incident is often chaotic or dramatic. Here, it was quiet. A pause on a trail, a bag left behind, and a hike that never reached its end. When Somari Tate failed to return as expected, the initial concern was cautious rather than panicked. Delays can happen on trails, and solitude often means limited communication. But as time passed, unease began to replace reassurance. There was no message, no update, no indication that plans had changed. For someone as consistent as Somari, that absence spoke louder than words. The first search efforts focused on retracing what was known. The river trail was methodically covered, with attention paid to areas where accidents were most likely to occur. The water's edge, uneven ground, and shaded stretches were examined closely. But there were no signs of a fall, no disturbed vegetation, and no personal items scattered along the route. Then the backpack was located. It sat beside the river, intact and upright, containing what Somari would have needed for a normal hike. Its placement was immediately troubling, not because it was damaged, but because it wasn't. Nothing about the scene suggested urgency. There were no drag marks, no footprints indicating a struggle, no indication that someone had taken the bag by force, or that Somari had left it behind unintentionally. As investigators documented the area, the lack of evidence became its own warning sign. In many cases, even brief moments of distress leave something behind: a broken branch, displaced soil, a dropped object. Here, the environment appeared undisturbed, as if time had simply stopped. The stillness made it difficult to determine where to look next. What didn't add up was not a single detail, but the absence of explanation. A prepared hiker does not walk away from essential belongings without reason. And yet, no reason presented itself. That contradiction marked the moment the search shifted from routine to urgent, from assumption to alarm. As concern deepened, the search for Somari Tate expanded in both scale and intensity. Specialized teams were brought in, and cadaver dogs were deployed to cover ground more efficiently than human searchers could alone. These dogs were trained to follow even faint traces, and when they picked up Somari's scent, it offered the first sense of direction the investigation had since her disappearance. The dogs followed the trail with purpose, moving away from the riverbank and along the path Somari was known to have taken. For nearly half a mile, the scent remained consistent, suggesting deliberate movement rather than panic or disorientation. Searchers marked each point carefully, hoping the trail would lead to an explanation, a place where something had gone wrong or where evidence would finally emerge. Then, without warning, the scent stopped. Not gradually, not as if it had faded with time, but abruptly. The final point was near a set of tire tracks pressed into the earth, inconsistent with standard trail use. The tracks appeared to belong to an off-road vehicle, one not registered or identified in connection with the area. There was no indication of when the vehicle had passed through, only that it had been there. This moment marked a turning point. An interrupted scent trail challenges assumptions. It raises questions about movement that didn't occur on foot, about transitions that leave no trace behind. Investigators were careful not to jump to conclusions, but the implication was unavoidable. Something had changed at that location, and it had changed quickly. From that point forward, the search was no longer confined to the trail itself. Attention widened to access roads, vehicle paths, and anyone who might have been in the area that day. What had begun as a missing hiker case was now defined by an absence with edges, one that suggested intervention without revealing its source. At this stage of the investigation, a difficult reality began to settle in. There was no clear crime scene. Despite the expanding search area and growing concern, investigators had not uncovered physical evidence that confirmed a criminal act. No blood, no torn clothing, no signs of a struggle. The absence forced the case into an uncomfortable space between possibility and proof. In many disappearances, violence leaves a footprint. Even brief encounters tend to disrupt the environment or produce trace evidence. The landscape remained unchanged. The river flowed as it always had. The trail bore the same markings it had before Somori arrived. And the backpack, still the most tangible clue, offered no indication of force or urgency. This lack of evidence complicated every decision that followed. Without confirmation of a crime, resources had to be balanced carefully. Investigators could not focus on a single theory, because none was supported strongly enough to stand alone. An accident, foul play, voluntary disappearance, all remained technically possible, even if some were increasingly unlikely based on Somori's history and behavior. What made this case especially troubling was how cleanly the narrative ended. The scent trail suggested movement, then transition, and then nothing. If a crime occurred, it left no conventional markers. If it didn't, the alternative explanations were equally difficult to reconcile with what was known about Somori Tate. In unresolved cases like this, uncertainty becomes the defining feature. Not because investigators lack effort, but because the facts refuse to align. The question was no longer just where Somori went, but whether something happened that the evidence could no longer reveal. As days passed without answers, the impact of Somori Tate's disappearance began to ripple outward. For her family and close friends, the uncertainty was immediate and consuming. Every hour without new information forced them to balance hope with realism, holding on to the possibility of discovery while preparing for the weight of what silence might mean. Volunteers from the surrounding community joined search efforts, walking trails, scanning riverbanks, and sharing information. Posters circulated, and social media amplified Somori's story beyond the immediate area. Strangers followed updates closely, drawn not by spectacle, but by the unsettling nature of the case, a disappearance that defied familiar explanations. Public attention brought both support and pressure. Tips came in, some promising, others vague or unverifiable. Each lead required time and energy to assess, often ending where it began. For those waiting at the center of the investigation, every false start carried its own quiet disappointment. The absence of progress became as exhausting as the physical search itself. Gradually, the focus shifted. Rescue gave way to recovery, even if that transition was never formally stated. Search efforts continued, but the language changed, becoming more careful, more restrained. What remained constant was the sense of suspension, life moving forward everywhere else, while Somori's story stayed frozen at the point where she vanished. In the aftermath, there was no closure, only endurance. The community learned to live with unanswered questions, and Somori's loved ones were left navigating a reality defined not by loss, but by waiting. Waiting for evidence. Waiting for confirmation. Waiting for something that might finally make sense of the silence. With ground searches yielding limited results, investigators turned to technology to bridge the gaps left behind. Drones were deployed to scan areas difficult to access on foot, offering aerial perspectives of the river, the surrounding terrain, and the dense tree line beyond the trail. From above, the landscape appeared expansive and exposed, making Somari Tate's disappearance feel even more improbable. One piece of footage quickly drew attention. A kayaker who had passed through the area around the time of Somari's disappearance had captured drone video along the river. In the distance, near the edge of the tree line, a blurry figure appeared briefly within the frame. The image was indistinct, lacking detail, but its timing and location placed it uncomfortably close to where Somari was last known to be. Investigators attempted to enhance the footage, slowing it down and isolating frames in hopes of identifying distinguishing features. The effort yielded little. No facial markers, no clear clothing identifiers, no movement definitive enough to confirm whether the figure was Somari or someone else entirely. What initially felt like a breakthrough dissolved into another unresolved question. This pattern became familiar. Each advancement in technology raised expectations, offering the possibility of clarity, only to reinforce the limits of what evidence could provide. The footage could not be dismissed, but it also could not be confirmed. It existed in a gray space, significant enough to warrant attention, yet insufficient to drive the investigation forward. For those working the case, frustration was unavoidable. The tools were there, the effort was relentless, but the answers remained out of reach. As the investigation continued, it became clear that technology alone would not solve this disappearance. Whatever had happened to Somari Tate had left behind a story too incomplete for even the most advanced methods to reconstruct.